book of Esther. We're talking about how God provides for your need. Even before you have a need, God has a special plan. Let me go back to chapter 1 and a couple of things that I want to touch on that we discussed last night, because this is a story that shows the providence of God, the sovereignty of God, and certainly how God works in the life of his people, Israel, and also in people like Mordecai and Esther. He works in their lives. So last week, we began with chapter 1, talking about that God knows your need, and God will make provision. Now, having said that, last week I gave you some dates, and some of you had a confused look on your face. So let me just again emphasize one thing. The children of Israel had been in bondage for 70 years before 516 BC. And you remember it was Daniel who was reading the prophecy of Jeremiah, and in reading it determined that God would keep them in bondage for 70 years. So Daniel began to tell the people to get ready, pack your bags. We're getting ready to go back home. It's been 70 years in captivity to Babylon and Medo-Persia. When we get to 516 BC, we talked about that last week, that was the time when the temple project was complete. The book of Ezra is the first returning back to the promised land. Ezra talks about bringing the first group back. As you read the book of Ezra, you'll see that. And Ezra begins to rebuild the temple there. And then in 444 BC was when Nehemiah led the group back to build the walls and begin to build the housing. Well, in between Ezra and Nehemiah, in that period of time, is when the book of Esther was written. And so we're in that time frame between Ezra and Nehemiah, between the building of the temple and going back to the land to build the wall. And so you can see on the chart exactly where the book of Esther takes place. Now, having said that, last week we began with the first 2 points on your outline, talking about the defiant queen. The defiant queen. Now, this is a wonderful story, and it all begins with the history of the church, the children of Israel, as they began to assimilate themselves in the land of Medo-Persia. And we talked about the defiant queen. Now, having said that, let me say that we read in verses 1 through 22 in the story of what was going on. You'll remember about the 6-month festival in the very first part of this particular chapter, in the year 482 BC, which was the third year of the reign of Artaxerxes, or as some people call him, Ahasuerus, who was the king of Persia in that third year. He began to have a 6-month festival to bolster the support that he would need to go and to attack Greece, because Greece had had a war with his father and had killed his father. He was going to get even. And so he put on a 6-month festival, verses 5 through 9 of chapter 1. And we found that in that festival, they began to talk about their battle plans and what they were going to do when it came to going to war. At the end of that 6-month festival, he put on a 7-day feast, or what we said in the original language was a 7-day drinking feast. The wine flowed liberally. And in that feast, Artaxerxes said, I want my wife to, his wife put on a feast for the women, because women and men didn't have a festival together in these drinking feasts. He said, I want my wife to come, and I want her to let her hair down, take her veil off, and dance for everybody who's here, all these drunken men that were there. Well, like we determined last week, just like the Islams, like the Muslims, women didn't take the veil off of their head in front of other men, just their husband. And so, especially not a room full of drunken men. And so, Vashti, who is Artaxerxes' wife, refused to do that. And because of that, she was relegated then out of her position of being the queen. That lined up this husband and wife fight. And so he said, if you won't do what I say, then of course I'm going to have to demote you. And then they went to war against Greece. They were 4 years preparing for the battle, and then 2 years more in fighting the battle. And when they came back again, he was sitting around home with nothing to do, and Vashti was no longer his wife, and he began to think about how nice she was and how comforting she was and how he missed her and missed having a wife rub his shoulders and all those things. So the wise men, the astrologers, gave him a plan. And that plan, out of the 127 areas of Persia, to bring together women from each of those areas, those providences, and bring them and place them in the harem so that he could then go through and pick the queen that he wanted. So that is the diligent quest. We come to the diligent quest. The defiant queen, Vashti, the diligent quest throughout all this 127 providences was to bring all a representative to the harem so that he could pick out his next wife. So we looked at the diligent quest. Now, having looked at those things, we come then to to chapter number 2 for today. We've looked at all of chapter 1. That gives you a historical look at what was going on. Now we come to the third point of this particular section, and that is a delightful queen. This, of course, is the story of Esther. We read verse number 5 last week of chapter 2, and verse 5 marks a distinct transition in the opening section. This is Act 1 of Scene 2, as it were. And here we're introduced to two major actors in this story. Two major actors, Mordecai, a man, and Esther, a woman, a young woman. Having said that, I want you to take a look, first of all, tonight in chapter 2 at Esther's life in the home of Mordecai. We're going to read verses 5 through 7 as we get a continuation of the story and the players in this story of how God provided. Take a look at verse 5, if you would. Now in Shushan, that's the capital, you'll remember, in Shushan, the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shemi, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem in the captivity which had been carried away Jeconiah, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for her his own daughter. All right, let's stop there just a minute. In chapter 2, we meet the heroine and the hero, Mordecai and Esther. Now, this account describes Mordecai in verse 5 as living in the palace of Shushan, the capital palace of the country, probably intimating that he had some position in the government of Persia. If you read all the way down to verse 19, and we see him sitting in the king's gate in verse 19, and that indicates that he held a position in the land of Persia. So Mordecai had taken the responsibility of raising his young cousin, whose name is Esther, after her parents died. We just read about that. Her parents died, and Mordecai took her in. Her name is derived from the Persian word meaning star, or perhaps even named after the Babylonian goddess of love. Her Hebrew name is Adashah. Now, that is from the literal translation of her Hebrew name is myrtle, or a beautiful fragrance. And so here she's got a beautiful name, even in the Hebrew tongue. Mordecai's name is from the Babylonian god Marduk. Now, that's important because we find here that historical evidence in the catacombs, in the tablets from the catacombs, indicated that there was a Marduk as a high official in the courts of Susa in the early years of Artaxerxes. Now, if that's true, then he was a trusted accountant of a well-known satrap. Now, that's a word you may not be familiar with, but a satrap was a governor of one of the 127 provinces, which would make Mordecai an accountant for a Babylonian in a Babylonian region of the land of Persia. So it's possible that this person was Mordecai as the accountant, but that gives us even further evidence that the book of Esther is a true story. All right, so Esther's life in Mordecai's home was one of being raised from just a young girl since her mama and her daddy had died. Then we come to Esther's life in the harem of Haggai. Now, we find here, this begins in verse number 8. Although the text gives no particular count as to how many women were brought to this harem from the 127 provinces, many of you may be familiar with the name, with the historian by the name of Josephus. Have you heard about Josephus? He was a historian, one of two historians back in this day. And Josephus counted that there and reported that there were probably around 400 women that were brought from all the provinces to the harem of Haggai. Now, these women were taken to the palace, in the palace complex, and they were placed in the house of the harem of the ruler there in the country. And one of those 400 finalists from the 127 provinces was our young girl that we're studying about, against all odds, a little Jewish girl at that, whose name was Esther. Now, take a look if you would. She immediately found favor with Haggai, who gave her preferential treatment, including the very best accommodations in the house. Take a look at verse 8. It says in verse 8, "So it came to pass that when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when all the maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace to the custody of Haggai, that Esther was brought also unto the king's house to the custody of Haggai, the keeper of the women. And the maiden," he said, "pleased him." The maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him, and he speedily gave her the things of purification, such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens, which were meet to be given unto her out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place in the house of the women. So he gave her all the best food. He gave her the best place in the house to be able to live. So Esther's time in the harem, while she was waiting for her turn to be brought before the king, Mordecai would visit Esther consistently most all the time. His access to the house, may I say, this house of women, and his status in the palace probably indicated that Mordecai was one of the eunuchs. So he was able to go in and out among the women. He also concealed or counseled Esther not to reveal her nationality in verse number 11. He said, don't tell anybody in the palace that you're Jewish. Why is that? Well, perhaps in his position, he was beginning to hear this anti-Semitism that was beginning to permeate the palace and the people in the palace, and he knew that the Jewish people were going to have some severe trouble in the near future. He hoped that in some way Esther's circumstances might serve to be able to assist the people in an opportune time. If you read chapter 4 and verse 14, Mordecai is telling Esther, it's for a time like this that you were born. You're in the place to be able to keep your people from being completely destroyed, from there being another Holocaust, as it were. So, though both Esther and Mordecai eventually showed great courage and displayed a national commitment to their Jewish heritage, I want you to understand that they didn't show in the early part, they didn't show any commitment to the God of Israel. You don't find them in any way praying in the early part of the book. Prayer is absent. They neglected the scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures. They violated the covenant that God had made with the children of Israel. And though we can applaud their moral courage, you have to acknowledge that they were apparently, there was apparent infidelity toward the covenant that God made with the nation of Israel. You don't see them acting according to God's word as the children of Israel should live. Now, the acknowledgement then serves to highlight a very true thing that I want you to understand. God was going to send them back to the land. God was going to do everything He promised them, even though they were not doing what God told them they had to do. God was still going to be faithful to them. And He acted to deliver His people, not based on their performance, whether they were praying, whether they were keeping to the dietary laws, whether they were keeping the laws of God. God didn't take that into consideration. His people had failed to keep the covenant, but God did not fail them. He provided for them deliverance. Now, having said that, that brings us then to Esther's life in the house of Ahasuerus. This picks up in verse 16. The last day came for Esther to appear before the king, armed with a natural beauty. She was a beautiful woman that exceeded all the other women in the harem. She was more beautiful than all 400 of the other women that had been brought from all over the land. And Esther then made her entrance before the king. If she had not pleased the king, she would have been sent back to the harem, been sent back with the concubines under the authority of Shashgaz, where she might never again be able to see the king. Verse 14 tells us. But King Ahasuerus, that's Artaxerxes, like the others in his palace, were all struck by Esther's beauty. Now, the Bible tells us that he chose Esther as his new queen, and he called for a feast to make the announcement and to celebrate the appointment to Esther being queen. Take a look at verse 17. It says, "And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in the sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the Bible says, and his servants, even Esther's feast, and he made a release of the providences and gave gifts according to the state of the king. So the king believed that Esther was his choice. But the eye of faith sees that Esther was not just the king's choice, she was God's choice. God put her in that place. Now, the king believed that he had all the control, but as we see, he was not the one in control. Though the king didn't know her identity, didn't know she was a Jew, didn't know what home she came from, even though he didn't know who Esther was, God knew who Esther was. And Esther's history may seem like a very simple Cinderella story as you read through it. An orphan, immigrant, a descendant of slaves, becoming the queen in the most powerful empire in all the world. And as exciting as that history might be, may I say that the book of Esther is more than just a Cinderella story. It's the story of God's promises, which never fail, and God's sovereignty, which will always enable God to keep his promise. So as we read this book, we see where God had promised Israel to bring them back into the land and bless them, and God's sovereignty did just that, even though they didn't keep the promises they had made to God. And so we see that it's the account of the reversal of expectation. Vashti, the queen of nobility, became demoted. Esther, the orphan and servant, was then elevated, and now she is the queen in the land. That brings us then to our message for tonight. We want to take a look at another player in this called Haman. And Haman had a hope to cause another Holocaust. This begins in verse 21 of chapter 2 and goes all the way through chapter 3 and verse 15. And in this section of the book, we're going to see a conflict arise and a date set for battle. But we mustn't miss the hidden conflict, the contest that was going to occur. Behind the conflict of Haman and against Mordecai and the evil element of Persia, along with the anti-Semitic look at the nation of Israel, there was an even greater battle that had been going on since the Garden of Eden. Satan, who is God's adversary, is always the aggressor. He's always looking for a way to destroy God's people. Why? Because he knows that the Messiah will come through the tribe of Judah. He knows the Messiah will come through Israel. So Satan, all down through the ages, was looking for a way to destroy Israel. That's the snowball effect of sin if it's unchecked. You remember what Jeremiah said? Jeremiah said, "The heart is deceitful above all things, and desperately wicked, who can know it?" Now, a wicked, angry heart, I think, is very fertile ground for adversity. I want you to remember Daniel chapter 10 at this particular point. Let me give you just a view from Daniel chapter 10. Behind the wicked heart of Haman, we can see the satanic hatred that Satan has for God's people. A spiritual conflict was waging behind the scene. Daniel reminded us of this warfare as it related to the nations of the world, and in particular to the nation of Persia. Now, you remember in Daniel chapter 10 that it tells us the story of Michael coming up against the prince of Persia. The prince of Persia in Daniel chapter 10, this is a reference to the spiritual world. It teaches us something about Satan and his imps. Evidently, there are a demon or demons that are associated with every empire in the world, even America. But here in Daniel chapter 10, it talks about the prince of Persia. He's seen as a rival for Michael, the holy angel who led and protected Israel in Daniel chapter 10. And Israel evidently or eventually returned to the land that they were taken out of under the leadership of Zerubbabel and in Ezra chapter 1, 2, and 3. And Satan and his demonic host had no desire to see Israel restored back into the land. And so they sought to thwart the Jewish effort while they were still in the palace before they ever got back to the promised land. That's what we're beginning to see now. And Haman is the one that Satan is going to use to try to eliminate the Jewish nation. So it was through the intercessory prayers of Daniel and certainly others of faith in that land, chapter 10 of Daniel, that God's heavenly host prevailed against the prince of Persia, against the demon that was over the land of Persia. The 70 years had been accomplished, and it was time now for God's people to be restored back into the land again. And though Daniel was not going to be able to go back with his fellow Jews, he did fight against Satan and his demons so that the children of Israel could go back to the land from his knees. Daniel was a man of prayer, an amazing and mysterious connection between the prayer of the righteous and the sovereign evidence that God is still in control. You remember what James says? The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. So as we explore and explain this historical story of personal and national conflict, don't neglect to see what's happening behind the scene. Daniel is praying. God, through Michael, is meeting with the prince of Persia and winning the battle, the spiritual battle, before the children of Israel go back to the land. So God's arch enemy had devised another plan. If they couldn't keep them out of the land, then Satan was going to destroy them in Persia. And Haman was the prize fighter, but Satan was the promoter. So he's going to use Haman. Now, having said that, take a look at the assassination plot being discovered. Interesting verses here. Notice what's unfolding. Assassination plot is unfolding. Verse 21 through 23. Notice what the Bible says. In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlain, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth, and sought to lay hands on the king Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, and told it unto Esther the queen. And Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when inquisition was made, questioning was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore, they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. So now we get into the meat of the story. Before the book of Esther explains the major conflict, it talks about the minor conspiracy. It was a minor conspiracy in the light of the outcome of the whole story with the children of Israel getting back into the land. But it was a major episode in the drama of God's providence. Mordecai had been named to a governmental post in the castle, apparently through the influence of Esther. Esther the queen had evidently gotten Mordecai a higher position in the palace. And he sat in the king's gate. That's the customary meeting place for all the Persian officials. We read about that in verse 21. So it was a large, elaborate structure where they would get together and take care of the needs of the government. No, as Mordecai carried out his official duties in the king's gate, he overheard two chamberlains planning the assassination of the king. He overheard them talking about assassinating, verse 21, King Ahasuerus. And whatever the cause, what caused him to be angry, we don't know. But whatever the cause, Bigthan and Teresh boiled to the point of murdering the most powerful man in the world of that day. And upon discovering their plan, Mordecai passed on that information to Queen Esther, who in turn confided the conspiracy, verse 22, to the king. Esther was there in the right place to pass on what was getting ready to happen. So swift judgment followed. It was great inquiry, and the conspirators, verse 23, were then hanged so that everybody would see what happens to anybody who tries to kill the king. The whole event, listen, the whole event, including Mordecai's discovery, was permanently preserved in the official record of Persia, the Chronicles. It was written down, it was put away, it was there in the Chronicles of the history books of the nation. These records recorded for later on, if you read chapter 6, all of a sudden the king pulls this book out to read and finds out in chapter 6 what Mordecai did, and wanted to find out if Mordecai had ever received a congressional medal for it. All right? So God used even the wicked intervention of those two conspirators to bring about his good pleasure. He got it written down, and now it's in the place where when it's time, God will bring it back to the forefront. Proverbs chapter 19 and verse 21 teaches the same principle. Solomon said, "There are many devices in a man's heart." Many devices in a man's heart. Nevertheless, the counsel of the Lord shall stand. You see, we can come up with all of our devices, but God's will is going to be done. And we're seeing that as the story of Esther and Mordecai and the king of Persia is unraveling. And as the story goes on, you're going to see how God continues to work so that his will and his people are found back into the nation. Next week, we're going to pick up with the Agagite's passionate disclose. If you don't know what an Agagite is, that is a son of Agag in the Bible. He's called the son of Agag, and we're going to find who it is and what he does as the story continues to unfold. See, Esther and Mordecai don't even know the extent of the problem that's developing, but God's in the background already working out the details for the provision so that his son may be born among the children of Israel. Shall we stand?